Hi everyone, my name is Leon and welcome to Leland PF's weighing lecture module. The first question that obviously needs to be answered is, what is weighing? Weighing is a way for a judge to evaluate a round. For example, you could weigh by saying that the judge should prioritize lives over the economy, and this signals to the judge that they are evaluating the round based off of who saves more lives. And as the name implies, weighing is essentially which argument holds more weight. The second question that needs to be answered is, why should you weigh? And the reasoning is really simple, because if you win weighing in your own argument, you basically win the round. Weighing is an easy path to a judge's ballot. The third question that's answered is, how do you weigh? And there's many ways to weigh, and the first way is through stomp weighing. Stomp weighing stands for scope, time frame, magnitude, and probability. The O is just there for, I don't know why. The first part of stomp weighing is scope and magnitude, and scope technically is a part of magnitude, so we're going to be grouping them together. Magnitude has two parts, and the first is scope. Scope is essentially how many people are affected. For example, you could say that all the US are affected, 7 million people are affected, etc. Severity is essentially how bad are they affected. For example, you could say that, 7 million people will be pushed into poverty, or 600,000 people would die. The second part of scope weighing is time frame, and there's two parts to time frame weighing. First is the short term, and these impacts kind of link into probability, because short term impacts usually have the highest probability. And the second is the long term, and these impacts would extend into the future. And long term impacts typically have the highest magnitude. And a problem with long term impacts is that if you can't prove the probability of your argument happening, then it makes it really hard to vote off of. And the problem with that is that it's really hard to prove probability of your argument happening. Because if it takes a long time to materialize, then there's always alternate unknown factors that might occur in the future that would alter your impact. So for example, in the future, something might mitigate your impact, or something might happen which makes it so your impact doesn't happen. So you would never know in the future, meaning that the probability is super low. And this is pretty useful if your impacts have less magnitude but happen in a shorter time frame. So that's also a really easy way to outweigh on magnitude through time frame. And the last part of stomp weighing is probability. And probability, as the name implies, is what is the probability that my impact gets triggered. So for example, saving lives is high probability and global thermonuclear war is low probability. And there's also many ways to weigh probability, such as uniqueness. And if you debated the Venezuela topic, many teams on the affirmative side made the argument that in the status quo, X amount of lives are taken each year because of US sanctions, meaning that the affirming is the only risk of solvency to save lives. And that's just a way to weigh probability. Essentially, it's saying that uniqueness controls the directionality of the link. And then second is strength of link. And strength of link is just saying that your arguments have less defense than their argument. It's not real weighing. And then third is through historical precedents, which is basically empirics. And it's just saying, our argument has materialized many times in history. There's no reason for it not to materialize again in the near future. And if you debated the OCO's topic, then many teams on the negative side made the argument that US cyber attacks have led to retaliation in the past, which means that they're going to be leading to retaliation in the future. Now we're going to be talking a little bit more about other weighing mechanisms. The first weighing mechanism that's going to be talked about is clarity of impact. And clarity of impact is my favorite weighing, even though it's not real weighing. And clarity of impact essentially tells the judge to prioritize your impacts because your impacts are quantified and your opponents aren't. And obviously this is only applicable when your opponent's impacts are unquantified. So let's talk a bit more about quantified numbers. The easiest way to weigh clarity of impact is by saying, our argument is more specific. We're going to grow the economy by per se like 1%. And once again, it's only applicable if your opponents say something like, our impact is really big, and don't give a specific number. These are two more weighing mechanisms, and both of them are pretty useful if you win them. The first is through linking in. This essentially says that, your argument can link into their argument, meaning that you would be solving for their argument, making their argument non-unique. And yeah, this is just saying that you can gain access to your opponent's impacts. And for example, on the Venezuela topic, on the negative side, if teams would be running this argument about regime change, and when they would hit arguments about how, US sanctions are bad for the people of Venezuela, they would just say, if we win that regime change happens, then this means that sanctions would be lifted, because then there's no point in US sanctions, meaning that if you solve for our case, then we can also solve for their case down the line, meaning that we link into their arguments. And this is a pretty good example of linking in, because it shows that the neg can access the AF's impacts. And the second, pretty important weighing mechanism is the prerequisite. And prerequisites are basically saying that your opponent's impacts can't happen unless something happens in your world. So for example, if a team were to be running an impact about terrorism and they're debating a team running an impact about the economy, then the team running terrorism can just make an argument that terrorism leads to less economic growth, meaning that solving for terrorism is necessary to solve for the root cause of their opponent's economic impacts. Now, this is all cool and all, but you might be wondering how to interact with weighing if your opponents read weighing to you. And the first way is obviously just like go line by the arguments, lay out 3 or 4 responses to it, each of their weighing mechanisms. But you can also meta-weigh, which is basically weighing mechanisms. So for example, you could say, oh, you should prioritize magnitude over probability because X, Y, and Z. And the last question that needs to be answered is, when's the best time to establish weighing? And honestly, weighing needs to be established as early as possible. And if you can establish weighing in the constructive speech, I encourage you to do that. But most effectively, weighing should be done in rebuttal and summary at the latest.